Ladies and gentlemen, good day and welcome to the seminar and audio conference on key issues and legal considerations for IT companies USA. This event is being organized by NASSCOM and Nishit Desai Associates in collaboration with Kegler Brown. The speakers are Nishit Desai, Founder and Managing Director, Nishit Desai Associates; Vinita Bhari Mehra, Global Business Attorney, Kegler Brown; Ralph Bretfellow, Global Business Attorney, Kegler Brown; Rajesh Simhan, Head International Tax, Nishit Desai Associates; Rakhi Jindal, Co-Head, Data Protection and Privacy Practice, Nishit Desai Associates. As a reminder, all participant lines will be in the listen-only mode. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end of today's presentation. Should you need assistance during this conference call, please signal an operator by pressing star then 0 on your touchtone phone. Also, you can download our mobile applet, Nishit Mobile, which is available on the App Store for iOS device, Play Store for Androids, and BlackBerry World to access the current updates and videos. Please note that this conference is being recorded. With this, I would now like to hand the session over to NASSCOM. Thank you, and over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good evening once again. I'm Nauzur Dalal, CEO for Enex Financials Limited. We are a Tata enterprise in the enterprise solution space. But more importantly, I'm here on behalf of NASSCOM. I'm a member of the Regional Council for the Western Zone for NASSCOM, and I'm happy to actually fill in for two of NASSCOM Western India stalwarts who are also good friends now. That's Rajiv Vaishnav and Chetan Saman. Unfortunately, because of some other commitments, they could not be here. So they handed over to me the sort of pleasant task of kicking off this evening session. The lady on the conference call made my life a little easier by introducing all the esteemed speakers for the evening, but whilst introductions, let me also take this opportunity to thank Nishit Desai and Associates and Desai Sir personally, as also Vinita, Ralph, Rajesh, and Rakhi for the time they have spent or will spend in terms of taking us through a very important aspect of how do we sort of make it simple for doing business in the US. Yeah. It sort of also resonates. Our Prime Minister has been saying that let's make doing business in India simple. Hopefully by the end of this session, we would all go back feeling that doing business in the US also is simple, provided sort of we keep all the legal considerations and the data privacy regulations in mind. So I think without further ado, let me sort of hand over to Mr. Nishit Desai, who really needs no introduction, a luminary in his field. Thank you, sir, once again for organizing this in association with NASSCOM. And thank you for all those who have taken the effort to come down to this place in Bandra, as also those who are on the call listening. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ralph, Vinita, and my colleagues, Rajesh and Rakhi. This is one of the most exciting subjects of particular globalization. My affair with globalization started sometime in 1977. I specialized in globalization at a time when India was localizing. Coca-Cola was thrown out in 1977. IBM was thrown out in 1977. And I did my master's in international comparative law, corporate law, and international tax and stuff like that. And there was no taker for my work. And but as it happened, just about the same time, one company came up, okay, and I helped them set up first New York office. That was TCS, by the way. Mr. Epsi Kohli was the head, and Mr. Palkiwala was also, I think, the chairman. And that was my first exposure to real life globalizing Indian company. And So, this subject I hold very much to my heart. And just as a matter of, little further take, uh, I personally do not believe in the theory of state. Nation is different from state. And next 30 to 50 years, you will see more and more disappearance of state. Everything will become global. Everything will become geography agnostic. And therefore, we all have to be prepared in one way or the other. So globalization to me is more a matter of mindset than what you call internationalization or multinationalization. Is a matter of physical offices elsewhere and stuff like that. So we need to understand that this is going to happen, and there'll be more and more search for new markets, new technologies, natural resources, market diversification, global finance, and a number of different things that would be happening across. More and more business would be, of course, on the e-commerce, whether it's B2B or B2C or P2P, people to people, peer to people, like Bitcoins. I expect that to happen in next 5 to 7 years. It will be most disruptive technology. It's very interesting technology, no doubt about it. And once Bitcoin comes, how will the currency function? We have already specialized in that subject. So we need to be cognizant as to what are the new things that are going to come up. And once again, we believe that every new technology, every new financial instrument, every new business model brings along with it legal, tax, business strategic issues. You look at Wi-Fi, WiMAX, quantum computing, e-commerce, fuel cells, nanotechnology, stem cells, medical devices, whether a drug or a device or stuff like that. Now on a global basis, we don't have even today what is called world patent regime. We are still divided by geographies. Some point in time we'll have to think. Now some of these are issues will need to be addressed. I'm not going to talk too long. But two things are happening. One, you have to look at your current national laws, and you also have to look at the international law, the foreign laws or tax or businesses or culture and stuff like that. But wading your way through all this complexity, I think one thing is happening that more and more laws are also getting somewhat harmonized today. So US has become the largest exporter today of laws, regulations, and policies. Possibly manufacturing is lost to China. At one point of time, we looked to England for all the education. Now it's all happening, and research is happening in the US. I see new age issues are coming up from there. So it will be very important to understand these dynamics, and how things change on a daily basis is also very critical. So, and as I see that cycles are also getting shorter and shorter. In 1930s, the Great Depression went on for 10, 15 years or whatever it is. Then the cycle reduced to 10 years, and then to 7 years, and then to 3 years. Now it is every 2-3 years cycles change, about 1,000 days, I would say. So it is very important that we know how business practices happen. Particularly now, I would just go to the US and they will talk a lot more about the US. US in one sentence, I would say, you call it United States of America. It's most un-United States of okay, and so it is very important to know at a broader level the US and at a state level US. I think I'm sure you're going to deal with all those things, and structuring is also becoming very important. So far, and I'll finish with that. So we all talk about structuring investment or IP. So investment structuring is very different from IP structuring, where to hold IP, where to house your intangible, unlike where to hold investment from. Those are two different kind of things. But when we talk about structuring, more important now is architecture. There's a slight difference between structuring and architecture. Work in architecture is more aesthetic, it is more conceptual, it's more philosophical. Why? Because just take a look at tax, for example. Um, so far, if you complied with a law, tax law, that was good enough. Because you see, this is fully compliant with law. Now what's happening? Apple, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, okay, Starbucks, they all complied with law. But the public woke up in England and, made a noise out of that. Everything was legal. There was nothing illegal about it. Okay, so you not only have to plan and structure, but also communicate with the public at large. The stakeholders are now looking at the whole thing very differently. Simply because you complied legally doesn't mean they did the right thing. So Starbucks, even though they didn't have to pay tax in the UK, they said, okay, we'll pay some kind of a moral tax. Okay, otherwise everything was fine. Irish double sandwich was very common going on. Apple, you know better than I know. Everything was perfectly okay. But still, you need to think of broader issues, because in India also now we got GAR coming up. GAR is going to be so much perception driven than just, in terms of hard black and white kind of a line, So, these are the situations really we need to deal with. And so, at a philosophical level, to what you call to your structuring level, to architectural level, at all levels, you take a holistic view. Then you mitigate the risk in terms of your reputation, in terms of your legal handling and stuff like that. And a role of a law firm, more and more going to be to provide higher value services. Compliance would be done more and more in-house, because that is more cost efficient, much faster, better, in some ways cheaper as well. So we will move on to doing higher value stuff, and the more important role than even legal, lawyers' role will evolve into more ethical advisors. All kind of, those kind of where judgmental issues come up on the board. So I'll stop at this point in time, and Rajesh, you are going to take off now?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, Rajesh is my brain count. I am a head count in the organization. So he will talk about structuring and other kind of things. Thank you.
Thanks, Rishit, for the introduction. I think there are a couple of key points that you sort of raised today, which I think is a good starting point for me, where you're talking about that there are three multiple different issues that are there. One is that even when you're talking about structuring, the fact that how you structure your companies is slightly different from how you probably structure for IT. Similarly, the other key thing which was really the question being that the way the world is sort of moving towards is that having a nice structure may not necessarily work. I think most countries, you have the OECD, which is coming up with a base erosion and profit shifting project, which people think is going to have a substantial effect over a period of time on the way companies are doing business. So you are moving towards increasingly what I would look at as a substance-driven sort of approach, even when people are looking at any sort of acquisitions or outbound or inbound structuring, whichever way you look at it. So when we start looking at it, and again, I'm going to pick up on different strands of topics, because the moment you start looking at, let's say, your overseas investment, there are, to my mind, three different aspects that you need to sort of keep in mind. The first is the laws relating to the country from where you are investing. So if you're looking at an Indian company which is investing abroad, let's say into the US, the first critical factor is what really are the regulatory framework in India as far as outbound investments are concerned, and what is the kind of restrictions which are sort of imposed. That's the first aspect that you always need to keep in mind. The second aspect is the laws relating to the host country, which in this case would be, let's say, US, since that's what we're talking about today, in terms of some of the conditions and restrictions which are there around the US law, around the US regulatory framework. And the third aspect, which sort of always floats around, is, do I look at direct investing? Do I set up a holding companies for investment? In which case, you are also looking at laws of a third jurisdiction that's also coming into place. So, when you're looking at any sort of structuring or any sort of investment outside of India, you have to take into account what are the different laws which sort of work in each of the jurisdictions. Different jurisdictions can sometimes be an enabling factor. For example, if you're setting up an intermediate holding company, that may be for just holding the equity shares. You may be looking at IP structuring in a completely different manner, where there are a number of incentives are provided in certain countries, both from a patent protection or a IP protection, as well as potentially from a tax perspective. So there are different strands which sort of go into sort of when you're looking at any kind of structure. Stepping back for a minute, there are times when even when you're looking at, let's say, doing business with the US, there is a critical distinction that is there between doing business with the country and doing business in a country. If you're doing business with a country, you don't necessarily need to have a physical presence or anything in the country. You do have, at least in the IT space, there are a number of companies which do business with the US but not necessarily in the US. So that kind of distinction is probably the starting point when you're looking at expanding into any country, because the question that always arises, do I really need to actually have an office or a company set up in that particular jurisdiction, and is it going to be a long-term situation, is it going to be a short-term project office sort of thing before you actually make that decision. And that sometimes is actually a critical factor, because what you need to keep in mind is that in most cases the country with which you're doing business with is probably going to be a high tax jurisdiction. So I think the US is a nice example of it, because if you're actually setting up and doing business in the US, you're looking at a federal tax, you're looking at a state level tax, and probably sometimes at a city level tax also. So you are dealing with a country where there is a high tax jurisdiction. So the question always is, okay, do I need to necessarily set up a presence in the US as far as investment is concerned? Once you take that call saying that yes, it does make business or commercial sense for me to make that particular investment, that's when all the different restrictions sort of come into play. I'm broadly setting out in terms of what really are the things that you keep in mind as far as India and possibly the intermediate jurisdictions are concerned. I'm going to leave it to Vinita and sort of talk about some of the US related issues. Primarily, when you look at the Indian regulations, there are probably, to my mind, 2 or 3 aspects that are relevant. The first is the exchange control restrictions, because unlike in most countries, India, you have the exchange control restrictions, which today provide that any investment abroad has to be by way of a joint venture or a wholly owned subsidiary abroad. Portfolio investments outside of India is permitted only under restricted circumstances. So that's always an issue that is there, saying because, for example, a lot of companies today in the IT sector are looking towards setting up something like an incubation fund. So the question always arises that is that something that is permitted under the automatic route or not? So that's something, there is always some degree of sensitivity around exchange control regulations. Today, an Indian entity can invest up to 4 times its net worth abroad. So anything beyond that, you need a regulatory approval. Until there's been some degree of back and forth by the Reserve Bank of India, they had reduced the limits a couple of years back to 1 times the net worth, but they've again increased it back to 4 times net worth. So as far as the quantum of investment is concerned, there are restrictions that are there. Similarly, there are restrictions around things like issuance of ESOP, because that's something very common in this industry, where you are looking towards potentially issuing ESOP even to, if you're setting up a subsidiary, let's say in US, and hiring key personnel, you want to issue ESOP. So the questions always arise around how do I sort of set up something as far as they are concerned. Third aspect that sort of comes into play is around the Companies Act, in terms of the, for example, number of layers of investment companies that you can set up prior to setting up of a operating company. Similarly, if you're doing an acquisition and doing a share swap, which again is something that is pretty common, there are restrictions that are there under the Companies Act, and even if you're a listed company, you have to. There are SEBI guidelines also that you sort of need to keep in mind. And I think the last one, which is sort of become critical, at least in the last few years, is also the antitrust and the merger control regulations, which is the Competition Act, which sort of comes into play as far as most large acquisitions are concerned, and something that we have seen quite frequently in the last couple of years, especially because you do have a large bunch of Indian IT companies who have a lot of cash in their books, which can be used for acquisitions. So merger controls also sort of have a role to play. As I said, the second part of it was really the laws relating to US, where you have to keep into account both the federal as well as the state level laws, and also similarly on the antitrust regulations in the US. And in certain particular spheres, there are certain regulatory or national security issues which are actually also relevant. We in fact recently had a client who had a substantial operations in the US, but unfortunately also had operations in companies which with which US has barred operations with, something like a Syria or Iran. So those are software aspects which also come into place when you're looking at investing in particular countries, saying that, well, US may not necessarily have certain bars on you, on any Indian company or Indian company having operations in the US, having operations in some of these blacklisted countries. So those are also issues that sort of come into play the moment you're looking at doing business abroad. The other aspect which I was talking about is really as far as the structural issues. When you're looking at saying that, do I invest directly in the US? Do I set up a holding company for really investment into US? If I'm looking at a acquisition sort of scenario, do I get in debt onto the books? At which level do I get debt in? Because do I get debt onto the Indian books and then use it for acquisition? Do I get debt onto potentially a holding company and then use that for the acquisition? So all of those become critical factors, and it sort of goes into what I call the ETR, the effective tax rate. Because depending on where you get debt in the books, for example, your deductibility will also sort of change, and Indian laws are not really, as in you have your own set of restrictions, even as far as deduction is concerned. And the critical aspect really as far as choices are concerned is really repatriation of funds, and that sort of becomes important because that's really what is your strategy. Are you looking at a organic sort of growth where there's not really going to be any sort of cash repatriation back? Are you looking at using the cash in the US for further acquisitions, which again there can be challenges around that, and we have seen structures where Indian companies have acquired US company, there's cash in the US books which has been used for further investment abroad, and then you're sort of stuck in a situation because when you look at how do I get the money back into India, I'm looking at layers and layers of tax before the money actually comes into India. We've actually seen situations where we've had an Indian company which held a US company, which again held an Indian company back. And the company was really struggling with how do I repatriate the cash, because I do want the cash back into the main parent company in India, but how do I get it back? Because when you sort of did the math, you realize that more than 60% was going towards taxes. So what you could really repatriate was only 40%. So that's where it becomes a critical when you're looking at saying how do I really go about it at the time of setting up of operations itself. The other question that is also there is that even when you're looking at, well, do I put in equity, do I put in debt, you also, in a lot of jurisdictions, you also have the ability to put in what you would call as hybrid instruments, where they're treated as debt for some purposes and they're treated as equity for some purposes. So all of those sort of become critical factors when you're sort of looking at the actual investment. The third thing which I said was what is critical is as far as repatriation. I think right up front you do need to decide as to what is the form of repatriation that is happening. Are you looking at dividend income? If I'm doing a debt push down sort of structure, you can get in interest flow throughs also coming in, and similarly a lot of cases you have managerial services where you sort of get either fees for managerial services or fees for administrative services. and in the context of royalty, especially royalty or fees for technical services. So that again becomes critical because today, if everything is happening from India and US directly, and you don't have, let's say, you don't have anything else in the structure, you're either going to be taxed in the US at whatever 35 to 45%, or you're going to be taxed in India at the same 30-odd%. So that's where it gets critical as to how do I really structure. Do we have the ability to potentially use a holding company which can hold IP and license it out to all the other entities in the group without necessarily having the IP held either in the US company or in the Indian company? And similarly, whether it is possible for me to really have the intermediate company sort of push down debt into the US. So that sort of becomes critical. So I know I'm sort of running out of time. So what I'm going to do is look at least the way at least some of the deals have been structured on the acquisition space. And I sort of picked out an example, not necessarily in the IT space, but something on the Apollo Cooper deal, which was in the manufacturing or the tire space. But it's very interesting because pretty much all the issues that we spoke about or I've been talking about has sort of been captured in this deal, because you effectively had an Indian company which is looking at acquiring a US target entity. And if you look at the way that they really structured the deal, what they did was that in the first place, I think the deal value was around 2.5 billion. The deal did break off, but the deal value was around 2.5 billion. So the first thing was that, okay, what do I do? In the books of Apollo India, I raise a $450 million debt, which in this instance was structured as an ECB, external commercial borrowing, where you take a dollar denominated loan, which the ECB norms today permit you to actually use that for acquisition or investment abroad. So you took a dollar denominated loan in the books of the Indian company, so that you had the ability to use that as a deduction in the Indian books against the profits of the Indian company. You push that down to Mauritius in this particular instance, which was really a global holding company as far as they were concerned, which went out into the Dutch holdco, which was an operating company, by the way. It was a holding operating company because it also had various other operations that were there. And then you had the US acquisition, where you had the Dutch holdco set up a Delaware entity, which then effectively merged into the target company, which is really the common way of doing an acquisition in the US, where you effectively also ensured that there was debt in the books of the target because it was effectively a leveraged buyout. So in this case, what they really did was that the $2.5 billion acquisition price was completely structured through pure debt. But what they did was that they ensured that they could have some of the debt in India, which could reduce the Indian company's sort of profits, and at the same time put the remaining debt into the US company, which could again go down as a deduction in the US. So that in the two high tax jurisdictions, they managed to get a deduction, while at the same time, since the profits were going to be upstream to the Dutch co, which should have been used for investment in some of the other places that they were contemplating about. So that sort of gives you a flavor really in terms of the way that when you're looking at sort of structuring abroad, some of the factors that you sort of need to keep in mind, at least from an Indian perspective when you're looking abroad. And again, since I know we are short of time, so what I'll do is I'll probably leave it up to Vinita to sort of look at some of the US aspects in terms of the key considerations once somebody is looking at the US for investment.
Alright, so I actually have a total of close to 40 slides, but because we have less time, we're just going to do a very high level overview of key issues if you're looking at doing business in the USA. My role here today is to just give you a basic outline of the legal landscape in the US. How many of you all are already doing business in the US, in the group? Okay, so we have a few. And then how many of you all want to do business in the US? I guess that's why you're sitting here, right? So maybe the rest of them. So obviously, US is definitely open for business. We see that happening with Obama's visit to India, or we see that by happening the Prime Minister Modi's visit to New York. Timing of in terms of investments and timing in terms of joint collaboration couldn't have been more ripe than it is as of today. And that's also is partly because both governments are making an effort to come up with joint policies to make the ease of doing business in the US for Indian companies to be much easier, and vice versa, having companies who are doing business in India much easier. So in terms of timing of investment and timing of market reality, couldn't have been much more right than before. We are also seeing a lot of stabilization of valuations of US companies. As Nishit Bhai had said that, US did go through a recession phase in the last 3 years. So the valuations was sort of, at low, but it still really didn't show the net worth of the company. And again, the whole concept of net worth in US works very differently from the way the net worth is here in India. So in terms of valuations of and pricing of companies, if you're looking at an acquisitions and things like that, have kind of, I would say, bottom out, and they have come to a balance way of coming up with the right value for the company in terms of acquisition. But one of the biggest statistics I want to bring to your attention is India is actually the 8th fastest growing source of FDI in the US. And actually, when we talk about foreign direct investment, we get very kind of narrow focus on just in terms of, like we said, acquisition, joint ventures, greenfield operations, but nobody looks at another aspect of India-US collaboration, which is actually export. So India is actually emerging to be the 8th largest export market. And when we talk about export, we're not only talking about goods, we're also talking about services. So for IT companies such as yours, what you're really doing in terms of your business is you're exporting services to the US. And it's actually become the 8th largest country in terms of export of both goods and services. The state of Ohio that we come from, where our law firm is based and most of the business we do out of, India is actually the 10th largest country just for the state of Ohio in terms of export of goods and services. So we see a lot happening in terms of exports too, in addition to just basic foreign direct investments that are coming into the US, I look at, business done between Indian IT companies and US in two ways. One is option one, which is contractual arrangements, which actually Rajesh very nicely pointed out is doing business with USA. And the way you will do business with USA would be through contractual arrangements that you have currently, be it with customer, service providers, wide variety or licensing of technologies, that's doing business with USA. The second option you would look at US would be a market entry strategy, which Rajesh very rightly pointed out, doing business in USA. So let's spend some time on what are some of the key legal issues you will face in a contractual formation. In a contractual formation, if you get a contract from a customer service provider, licensing technology, you have to keep in mind one clause that will be in that agreement will be compliance with what we call the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, which is called FCPA. What the FCPA is actually was enacted in 1977, and it actually requires that a US person should not get into any bribery situations, obviously within the US as well as in foreign jurisdiction. However, what happened with the FCPA was in 1998, there were certain amendments that came on to the FCPA which made the enforceability of the FCPA beyond extraterritorial jurisdiction to extraterritorial jurisdiction, but also said that if you have agents, distributors, service providers in foreign countries, and you are doing a transaction with them, you have to make sure that they also comply with FCPA. So what has happened in the US legal industries and contract formation is, as a safe harbor rule, any contracts that you will work with will have an FCPA compliance clause. And at least we've seen, and you can also check with Nishit Desai and Associates, 8 out of 10 times that's non-negotiable. At least as a US advisor, if I am working with a US company and an Indian company says, and we hear this a lot of time, Gauri and I have worked on a couple of matters where we hear, we are not a US company, why the hell should we comply with FCPA? We have Prevention of Corruption Act here, you won't put that into the contract. But I can tell you, at least 8 out of 10 times, that's a non-negotiable clause by a US company or by the US legal advisor. So mentally, you have to be prepared that in any agreements that you'll get into in the US, you would have to deal with this compliance clause. Now, there are two ways of doing that. One is you can blindly sign that contract and say, we'll comply with FCPA. But if you do nothing about it, and there would be some FCPA anti-violation, then in addition to the US companies, and if the lawyers are smart, they'll have an indemnification clause. They can come after you for not complying with FCPA. So what we advise to our Indian clients or any foreign company who's doing business with a US company is, if you have decided to sign off on a clause which has an FCPA obligation on it, then internally spend the time to put an FCPA compliance program in place, because then you're also making your own safe harbor compliance provisions, so that if there is any violation by default or inadvertently, you have also have enough evidence to show that you put a compliance program in place. And law firms like Nishit Desai and other firms can help you to put that in place. So we always say, don't blindly just sign the agreement. Oh yeah, my US customer's telling me, what's the big deal, I'll sign it off. There's also going to be an enforceability and obligation test. So think of putting compliance programs in place if you have signed off on a clause like this. And then most importantly, if you're going to use third-party service providers or agents or subcontractors for your agreement, the buck doesn't just stop at you. You want to make sure your third-party service providers, your agents, also comply with this clause. So you should have code of conduct or policies which would then also apply to your third-party service providers or your subcontractors who are working on that agreement or that project. Another aspect you will see in contractual arrangements in the US is you get a lot of restrictive covenants that are put into the agreements. Restrictive covenants are nothing but they are basically your non-competition, your non-solicitation, your non-disclosure. However, in US, and Rajesh hinted to that, a lot of the laws are at federal level and at state level. So the restrictive covenants is one good example where you have to do compliance under a federal law level as well as a state law level. A good example is the state of Ohio again, and that's the best example I can give. That's where we come from. State of Ohio actually very strongly favors restrictive covenant in terms of non-competition, non-solicitation, non-disclosure, in terms of enforceability. But there are many states who are very stringent. They're not like the state of Ohio. So when you are doing a transaction and when you get an agreement, if it says the laws of Delaware will govern the agreement or the laws of Ohio or the laws of California, you would want to spend time with your legal advisors to see that at a state level, what does this mean for you, the restrictive covenant, and then at the federal level, what does that mean, because like I said, restrictive covenant enforceability is definitely at state level, But however, there are certain parameters which the courts have put in terms of enforceability. If those parameters have been fulfilled, then restrictive covenants will be enforceable. So for example, they want to make sure that the protection is no greater than what is required. Another good example is they want to make sure it's not harmful to the public, And even in some cases, if they find that restrictive covenants are not enforceable, the courts use what they call the blue pencil rule. Okay, the blue pencil rule is that they will not have the entire covenant unenforceable. They will try to come with a modified version of the covenant and enforce that. But having said that, this blue pencil rule is again enforceable and used in some states or not used in other states. So Ohio is one state where they do have the blue pencil rule, which shows the flexibility and enforceability of restrictive covenants in Ohio. There are some other states who don't have the blue pencil rule. So if a covenant is considered unenforceable, then it's completely striked out. There's no kind of modification as such. So these are some nuances you want to keep in mind when you start seeing these clauses in your contractual arrangements to see how would it impact you in case if it's considered unenforceable on both sides, then would you have some modification by the court or not, So those are the two main clauses we see on any contractual arrangements, which would be very important for the Indian companies, Another aspect of your agreements would be your IP. Now, when you are having, as an IT company, there is going to be some kind of intellectual property that's going to be involved. That intellectual property can be obviously in various forms, or they can be federal trademarks, copyright, trade secrets, patents, domain names, and so on, Again, in the US, intellectual property can be protected at a federal law level as well as a state law level. Trademarks is a good example. Generally, intellectual property of the trademark registrations are registered at a federal law level. But then sometimes what happens is, we've seen with clients, they're not able to register their trademark at a federal law level because there may be, descriptive words are not used and all. But if you know your business is only going to be selected to 2 or 3 states, and it's not going to be done on a federal level there, you can even narrow down your scope of registration, and under specific state law registration, you can register your trademark, which gives you protection in that state. So state of Ohio, we have a provision which allows you to register your trademarks with the secretary of the state, and then which provides you with that protection in the state of Ohio. So that's a good example of federal law compliance and state law compliance. Then, you know, copyrights are obviously federal law compliance, so you have to only look at the federal laws if you're trying to protect your copyright. And then India, US both are parties to the Berne Convention, so which provides a lot of protection under the convention to a US, to an Indian copyright in the US. And then the most important piece of IP I would like to bring to your attention in terms of protection in the US is what we call trade secrets. As we know, in India, we do not have a trade secret law. Trade secrets are currently protected through confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements and a contractual protections that you have. However, in the US, at a state level, there are specific state laws which actually protects your trade secrets, and if there's a breach of your trade secret, it helps you to enforce that. So that's a lot of time we talk to clients that they may be having IP which cannot be protected from a statutory perspective. You know, for some reason we can't get a copyright, or for some reason the patent is not, we're not allowed, we can't get a patent, or we can't get something. So we sometimes look at the fact that can this be protected under the State Secret Act we have of that particular state. Because, you know, there are other ways to also protect your IP beyond just the standard run-of-the-mill statutory arrangements. So it's very important in the particular state, if you do have trade secrets, to take a look at that under that specific state law, can your trade secret be protected? And if yes, when you're drafting those kind of contracts under the specific state laws, we actually then suggest to put particular clauses if it is truly a trade secret, which will then give you protection under that specific state laws also. But however, people misconstrue the concept of trade secret. The laws are very clear in their definition of what is considered trade secret. So trade secret is basically anything that the owner knows or the founder knows and nobody else knows. And if actually the half of the public knows your secret, then it's not considered trade secret. A good example we give is the Coca-Cola secret recipe. If you know or not, Coca-Cola has not done any statutory protection of their recipe. They protect their recipe under the trade secret concept. You know, another good example of your trade secret would be your customers list, unless you use it for marketing or things like that's different. Another good example is your manufacturing know-how, or if there's a particular services know-how, the way you develop a software, or the way you provide a particular kind of services. If it's kept, you know, within the small group and it's only used by your engineers and all, that could come under the definition of trade secret. So it'll be very important to understand that can you come under the definition of trade secret, because what you may consider a trade secret may not be a trade secret, you know. Another good example is, a good example of the right trademark strategy or the right IP strategy a company used in the US is Amazon. Amazon, when they started, they actually took a decision that they're not going to go berserk registering every trademark, brand name or patent and all. They decided to have a strategy of registration and deferral as and when the need came. So Amazon created a brand with the name Amazon, then they created a logo with the name A, had a brand recognition, did that trademark. But soon Amazon realized that their unique USP has been the way people purchase goods on Amazon. So they realized that this one-click method, or what they call the I-click method, is actually what's leading to people to get on Amazon website and buy products. And then they realized that this is their USP, you know, and that's what's getting the brand Amazon value. So they actually patented a right, which the way you click on that and purchase goods is actually patented by Amazon in the US. So their strategy worked really well. They saw what works with the market, does it have IP value in it, and then obviously is it registerable. So that's a good example we give to clients, especially IT companies, that when you come to the US market, you don't have to register everything. You don't have to get a patent on everything. You have to first see what is going to be used in that market, because as you know, IP protections are country specific, you know, so you want to be very strategic about what you want to register there and what you don't want to register there, what will be used and so on. And the Amazon model is a good example of that, you know. This is the IP, the click thing, I think you all saw that. Now, how do you protect your intellectual property assets? I said there are obviously various ways you can protect it through statutory protection, but there's also, if you cannot get a statutory protection because of costs or the other issues, then a good way of protecting them is limiting access. So in your contractual provisions, you know, we recommend that you have clauses which very clearly says who will have access to your IP, what's going to be done with that IP, what is going to be kept confidential, and then also have IP audit clauses, you know, especially on the software technology side of it. And then even if there's disclosure to third persons, make sure there's a requirement in your contract that the party to whom you're disclosing is going to forward that to a third person. They'll also have the same terms and conditions in terms of confidentiality and non-disclosure. So paying attention to contractual provisions will be very important in terms of protection of IP. Let's move on. That's the sort of important piece in contracting. We come across a lot of times, especially with Indian companies, especially which are small family-owned companies, there are parties who are signing off on agreements, but may not be associated with the agreement as a director or an owner, may not even have authority to sign that agreement. On the face of it, it looks pretty okay. That's fine. We have our party sign on it, the Indian party sign on it. When the dispute arises, and a little bit of discovery is done at the time of dispute, then it's realized that the party who signed or the person who signed the agreement on behalf of the company did not have rights to do that. So we actually recommend to clients all the time that make sure that the proper party is signing the contract. And then most importantly, if you're going to enter into contracts on behalf of your global entity, make sure the appropriate person is signing the contract in the appropriate capacity. We don't use the word owner and shareholder and all, because then you're opening up a can of worms in terms of personal liability issues in the US. Use official titles like president, members, managers. We see enough contract where we see the name of the company and it's left blank, and when the contract comes back, somebody signed, written down shareholder, and then we see that could be a problem for the Indian company in US. So just basic nuances like that, nobody looks at the last page after it's signed. We actually tell the clients, make sure whoever's signing has the authority to sign. You have authority to back up that they had the authorities to sign, and then very clearly put down their official title in the company, so that there's no disputes moving forward. So that's another contract nuances that you want to keep in mind. Lastly, obviously, we're getting into contractual arrangements. There's always a clause on dispute resolution. What happens when things go down south? At least 8 out of 10 times you'll see clauses where they want to have litigation in the US. But obviously, why not? They are the big customers. They're the big, 100,000 pound gorilla. What are you going to fight with them about? Arbitration in India is never going to happen. So what happens is if you do get into litigation in the US, either you want to sue them or they sue you. At least most of the time you would have to look at two jurisdictions, whether you come under federal jurisdiction or would your case fall under the state jurisdiction. And in many cases, you will see that you will fall under the federal jurisdiction, which is the federal courts. In a particular state, there are federal courts. If any of the issues of the dispute is under federal law. Or if you're suing, as you are getting sued as a foreign national from a different state from where the company is located, and if the damages are more than $75,000 US, you will get sued in the federal court. So generally, basically, the federal court jurisdiction comes into place where there's diversity of citizenship, or there's a federal law issue. So it will be fought in a federal court. Everything else will then be fought at a state level court. But most of the disputes we see on the cross-border side, and there's a lot of cross-border litigation. We see it on the federal court side. Now, when people have to sue or get sued in the US, especially Indian companies, they get very shocked, and in some way they are scared of the costs which is associated with litigation. But we need to keep in mind that litigation in the US moves much faster, and I can't even emphasize the word much faster than the litigation we are used to in India. So there's always a speed into that litigation, and therefore there are costs associated with litigation there. So you will see costs associated with legal fees. There's a huge discovery cost depending upon what the issues are. Sometimes discovery costs can actually take up a big toll in terms of, you have to produce documents to the court, you have to produce documents to the other side, and we actually tell the parties that as soon as you know a dispute is going to arise, you start having a document retention plan. Every document which is a part of the dispute, make sure that somebody is retaining that. Because a lot of states in the US have also come up with what they call the e-discovery rules. Anything which was exchanged through emails and things will all become a part of the discovery. And the discovery cost can sometimes be substantial. If there is an issue which requires an expert subject matter, then you'll be an expert witnesses. So there'll be cost of an expert testimony. And then the thing is, if you are the losing party, then you should be open to the idea that you're going to be paying the other party's attorney's fees also. That's also pretty common in litigation in there. And then unlike what we see in India, punitive and compensatory damages are a little difficult to get from the court, but there is a possibility of also getting compensatory and punitive damages awarded by the court. So as you can see, there's various levels of cost that you would have to deal with if you get sued there or you want to sue there, and actually Ralph can speak much more, but he's much more of a litigator. My background is mostly transaction, but you will see it's much speedier to get justice there in terms of litigation, even though the cost could be a little higher than what you're used to paying here in India. Again, market, the second option, like I mentioned, if you are not doing contractual arrangement, but you're looking at doing business in USA, then a lot of options are there for market entry operations. Rajesh did a pretty good job of how you can structure your operation, but once you structure it, what do you plan to do in terms of your market entry operations? What kind of entity would you like to set up there? Would you like to set up a corporation, a general partnership if it's a joint venture, a limited partnership, an LLC, or a branch, or if you're going to do sort of non-for-profit work, there's also a concept of a non-profit organizations. Generally, what we see a corporation together with an LLC is the most preferred entity, preferred form of legal entity used by foreign investors. Out of it, there are a couple of reasons for it. One is because the shareholders are responsible, are not responsible for the actions and responsibility of the corporation in terms of liability. So there's limited liability protection you get in a corporation. The other thing is there is the liability protection. We have a concept there of piercing the corporate veil, pretty used to similar to the concept here in India. And that's only done if there has been a fraudulent activity at the corporation level. The other good advantage is that there are tax treaty benefits, if you're a C Corp. There are two kinds of corporations in the US. It's called an S Corp or a C Corp. As a foreign shareholder, you cannot set up an S Corp. That's only for domestic shareholders, but you can set up a C Corp. And, we're not getting into tax structure here, but, there's advantages of having a C Corp because then you can have the benefit of the India-US tax treaty. There's still a gray line rule, and Rishabh, I can speak a little bit more about it. If you have an LLC, which is like a flow through, can you still have the India-US tax treaty benefit? So generally, for a lot of reasons, a C Corp is what we see foreign investors coming in through, except for if there's a joint venture and there are multiple partners, then an LLC can be used as a corporate governance for structure. But then for tax purposes, the LLC can be taxed as a corporation. That's also possible. So again, you want to think about what kind of entity you want to set up there, and look at obviously the tax structuring of those entities. And like I said, the common reason for having a separate entity and not having like a branch or like an office there is obviously the limited liability protection. You want to try to protect the parent company as much as you can in terms of liability protection and have a separate entity. The nuance in the US is to choose the state you want to be incorporated in. Because unlike what we see in India is that if there is one federal law, which is the Companies Act, once you incorporate under the Companies Act, you're free to do business in any part of India. In the US, that's not the case. Incorporations are state specific and are governed by state laws. So if you incorporate in a particular state, you're allowed to do business in that state. If you want to do business in another state, so if you incorporate in Ohio and then if you want to go do business in Delaware or Georgia or New York, you have to take your US entity and qualify them to do business in that other state. So that's why it becomes very important for any Indian company to do the due diligence, what is the state they want to incorporate in. Some of the considerations we ask the clients to look into is obviously you want to see what is the annual state and local taxes. Because again in US, you're taxed at 3 different levels. You're taxed at a federal level, then you're taxed at a state level, and then you're taxed at a city level. So if you are in the state of Ohio and you're in the city of Columbus, there'll be a city tax, then you'll pay a state tax, and then you'll pay a federal tax. So it's very important to do the analysis. In some states, state tax is eliminated, and there's only federal tax that you have to pay. So sometimes that due diligence is important, that take a look at what are the annual state and local tax requirements. How favorable is the corporate governance law? So a good example is the state of Delaware. Everybody is very well versed with Delaware because it has very sophisticated and mature corporate governance law. So as a foreign investor, you get comfort with the fact that there are enough case precedents on foreign investment. So they may want to go to Delaware. So you may want to take a look at that. And then obviously you want to see if it's fast, simple and inexpensive. You can actually incorporate a company by yourself, going online on the website of the Secretary of State, and within 2 days you can incorporate a company in the US. Very different from what we are used to in India. So think about the choice of the state of incorporation when you're going to the US. You know, I won't get into tax consideration, Rajesh went into that. But generally the rule of thumb is that if you are going to have dividend distribution out of your US company, there's a flat 30% withholding tax, provided it is reduced by the India-US tax treaty. So that's going back to Rajesh's point. You want to be able to make sure that before you start putting your money in the US company, how do you want to take your money out? And then if you're taking your money out under as a dividend, royalty, depending whatever category, you have to remember there's a 30% withholding tax, provided we can structure it under the India-US tax treaty that the withholding tax becomes less. So you want to pay attention to investments and repatriation as to in what form you want to repatriate, and minimize your tax exposure when you're repatriating funds out of the US. And I'm going to I wanted to spend some time on Ohio tax structure, but you're going to get the slide, so we'll just skip it. Ohio is just one example. But Ohio, the only thing I want to bring to your attention on Ohio is there's no corporate income tax on the top of the federal income tax. So that's been one of our key things. And there's no tax on sales of goods and services to customer outside of Ohio. So we see the state of Ohio as a big logistics and distribution center. So we have a lot of companies who come there and set up the distribution center, hold their inventory there, and where they're distributing and selling to other states or to customers in other states, because then they see that there's no tax when it comes to sales outside the state of Ohio. So Ohio has some very favorable tax environment, and that's why we see a lot of foreign direct investment. So we have the TCS has set up a 750 R&D center in Milford, Ohio, which is about an hour and a half from Columbus. We have Jen Irrigation, who has set up their distribution center in Ohio. We have Mahindra's, or what used to be Satyam Technologies, but it's Mahindra Technologies now. They have a 10-person office doing IT services and software development. So we see increasingly Indian companies looking at Ohio because it has a very favorable tax environment. And then most importantly, we've actually left some brochures here. The state of Ohio is actually hungry for foreign direct investments, and they are very desperate, I would use the word, to have more and more companies invest in Ohio. So they are actually willing to sit down with companies and talk about what incentives they can give an Indian company to set up operations in Ohio, and how can they help you to do that. So there could be tax incentives, there could be loans by the government for a company to buy equipment, or they're also giving what they call training program loans. So if you have 10 employees who need to be trained in a particular area, the state is providing the money for you to train your own employees. So they are actually going that extra mile to bring in more FDI into the state. So, and there's going to be a brochure left outside, or I think in your bags, which talks about the Columbus region and the offer that the state of Ohio is willing to put on the table for FDI purposes. We'll just skip the labor and employment issue. The only thing you want to keep in mind when you start hiring employees in the US, there are some very stringent mandatory labor requirements, very similar to what we are used to here in India. But the two biggest thing you want to keep in mind in terms of labor law requirement is that America has a Disability Act. So if you do have an employee who becomes disabled or applies for a job, becomes disabled, you need to make sure that the company has arrangements put in place to to accommodate that employee. It's a law. You have to actually accommodate your employee's disability. That's the bottom line according to that act. The second thing you want to keep in mind is they do have what we call anti-discrimination laws. And actually anti-discrimination laws has extraterritorial jurisdiction. So if a US company has employee here in a subsidiary and has control over the subsidiary, the anti-discrimination laws that we have in the US can also apply to their subsidiary if there was any discrimination. So basically you have to hire employees, give them equal opportunity, and you cannot discriminate based on sex, based on religion, ethnicity. So they're very stringent anti-discrimination laws. And actually, you will see each state has a civil rights commission. So if an employee is discriminated, it's a case is filed against the state, and then the company can be prosecuted. Sometimes it doesn't do great for the company's branding. So you have to keep in mind, you understand at least these two provisions of labor law, which is anti-discrimination laws and Americans with Disability Act. because that's very unheard of in the US, in India. Yeah, I know India just recently passed a sexual harassment act. I don't even know after how many years, and now it's become a big thing. In US, that's just the norm. So you better be used to that when you enter that market, and you would need to put compliance programs in place so that you don't go foul of these acts. Lastly, I want to share with you US immigration category. We always hear from IT companies when I meet them in the US, fine, this is great, I have a great customer, I'm sending people, but eventually, how will I send people there? What are the different categories I can send? How will I cater to a market? Because I do need my Indian managers. I do need my Indian engineers to be there. Our law firm doesn't practice immigration law, but we work with an alliance partner. We only play a role of advisory capacities because we do the business side of the contract. So we come in and just give the advisory capacity. But immigration is a very big issue for IT companies who are doing business there. The most common kind of immigration category we see is what we call the L1A visa. This is if you have an entity in the US, then you can transfer your employees from India to the US on a L1 visa, for catering to your US market business. But however, you can only do that if there are certain categories fulfilled. That is, your employee must have worked with you for 1 year in India before it's transferred out to L1. And the employer has to show that that person, manager, has expertise, and for the specific project that the manager is coming for, the multiple number of project manager, he has the background. So it's not that you can use the L1 visa to just transport people. There are criteria that need to be fulfilled. Actually, there were a lot of case laws which are happening currently in the US. TCS got whacked, HCL. There was actually a Department of Justice is after them because they supposedly they alleged that they used the L1 visa category to transport employees who did not fulfill the criteria. So there's actually a Department of Justice investigation going on TCS as well as on HCL of misusing this category. But let's see what comes out of that. There's a E1 treaty visa, where if there's substantial trade between US and another country, then a trader from that or an executive from that country can come. Generally, from India-US perspective, this E1 treaty visa we've seen doesn't work a whole lot, because we haven't been able to still, and hopefully things will change, establish substantial trade. For example, UK and USA, they have been able to use the E1 treaty traders visa. The next is what we call the E2 treaty investors visa, which is basically you come and set up a company in the US. If you are a 50% owner of that company from a thing, and you make substantial investment to a US enterprise, you can use the E2 treaty visa to come to the US. But the most common form that we are seeing, or I should say the most used form of treaty visa we are seeing is what we call this EB5 immigrant investor visa. What has happened is when Obama became the president the first time around, he realized that they need more foreign direct investment. And what is the best way to bring in foreign direct investment is that you put in an X amount of money and we promise you a green card. Basically, that was the bottom line of the EB5. What we started seeing is that EB5 was happening, but not in areas that America wanted it. So they changed the EB5 program and they said, okay, if you are an investor, individual investor, and if you invest about $500,000, $500,000, but you have to invest in a high unemployment or rural area. And if you do that, then we'll give you an EB5 visa, which is like a green card, Or if you're a company, you invest $1 million elsewhere. You don't have to invest in a rural or unemployment area. But if you invest $1 million and you hire 10 qualifying US workers, then within the 2 years of your establishment or invest in a regional center, you get an EB5 visa. So they actually modify the rules and they try to kind of expand, so they bring more investors in. The biggest beneficiary of EB5 investors have been which country? Do you want to take a guess?
China.
There you go. Somebody said China. But then what happened? Because there's a Democrat and Republican party there, they have put a cap on the China investors on EB5. Anyway, the EB5 has 10,000 visas cap. Among that 10,000 cap, they put a cap as to how many Chinese investors can use the 10,000 visas. So actually, that's kind of backward thinking. And President Obama has been trying to have an immigration reform and all that. And I don't understand politics better. Ralph understands it better than I do. I don't know when that will happen, but they're making strides to bring in more investment by giving them visas. But yeah, China, unfortunately, were the biggest EB5 investors, and unfortunately now have a cap, but things will change. We are hoping they do. But anyway, thank you for your time, and I believe we're going to have some time for Q&A later on. and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ralph.